I'm just going to very briefly say a few things and leave it to the panel to do the work of explaining the rules and paradigms of this specific conversation. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land where we work and where we gather and where we live. At UBC, we are the uninvited guests of the Musqueam. And I've been thinking a lot this year about land acknowledgements and how we perform them or invoke them or embody them at UBC. And that when we give a land acknowledgement, we're doing this in order to cultivate awareness, understanding, and respect. And we do this also to bring our attention to creating an honest practice of reciprocity. So I'm just very grateful that we're here to do that work together today, and I thank you. I'm not going to talk about the panel, image banks, information systems, and economies of desire. I'm going to let Felicity do that. So I'll just give a brief introduction for Dr. Felicity Tayler. Thank you for being here to imagine ways of having this conversation and participate and facilitate the panel. Dr. Tayler is the interim head of research services, arts and special collections at University of Ottawa. Most recently, she curated Desire Lines, mapping the metadata of Toronto arts publishing for the Art Gallery at York University. Her interests include art historical metadata modeling, data visualization, and the print culture of artistic community. Taylor's critical and scholarly writing has been published widely, and her many related exhibitions have taken place across Canada, and we're thrilled to have you here at Vancouver at UBC today after thinking about this archive and show so much. Please join me in a warm welcome for our panelists.
Hi everyone. So I'm sitting here with DJ Fraser and Shaunna Moore. And the event today is going to take a bit of a kind of free-flow conversation, responding to some image requests that I sent out ahead of the talk. And so I'm here because I wrote an essay for this catalog. And then I guess I was asked to come and speak about some of the aspects of that essay, but I didn't really think that it would be kind of reflective of the way that I work or the way that I understand the structure of Image Bank to work, and kind of what the relationships of me to the Image Bank are, to do it alone. And so I wanted to surround myself with people who are kind of representative of my network or how I understand thinking about the objects that are on display in that exhibition room and what it might mean kind of as it echoes forward in time. And so just to kind of begin that thought process, I also made a list of all the people, so right now I live and I work in unceded, unsurrendered Belkin and Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa. Prior to that, I lived in Montreal, Dage. So I don't really have like a local relationship to Vancouver or to the communities who have lived here. So the kind of list that I'm going to name now is like my way of telling you who the bodies were that helped me understand this place. And they're not always situated here either. And it was in relationship to the Morris Trasov Archive, although there's other ways that I've entered into this place as well through its stories. With regards to Image Bank, Michael Morris and the Trasov spent many hours of their time with me. Thank you very much. I've also had an extremely long-term friendship with Louis Jacob, who's done work around their work. In Montreal, I had an incredibly important, supportive group of kind of a conceptual resurgence that happened with Robin Simpson, Vincent Bonin, my thesis supervisor Joanne Sloan, and sort of in that mix, like Michael Turner kind of showed up and gave me some local stories as well. While I was looking into Roy Kiko and his work here and his communities here, as they overlap with the image bankers, I also spent a lot of time listening to Carol Itter and to Daphne Marlett. And then I had other contemporaries like Julia Pollock O'Neill, who kind of showed up, who were doing work around this at the same time that I was. DJ, and Adam Welch, who's at the National Gallery now, and Gregory Betts, who's at Brock University, but who has just published a pretty large book that brings together a lot of archival material that's in many different collections that talks about this place. And then also important along the way were the archivists that I encountered here at the Belkin. So I have Christina Laszlo, Anna Tidland, and I only just met Shaunna Moore. But I'm trained as a librarian and as an archivist, and I've worked that way professionally for many, many years. I guess I now run a unit in University of Ottawa in that area, professional area. And so with Shaunna, I really feel kind of like an extended, long-term kind of relationship based on our professional training and understanding of the systems that order things so that we can find them, or so that things are revealed and concealed. And so this is kind of the way that I wanted to structure this talk as well, in the sense that I have DJ who thinks through the queer theory and the kind of challenges to ordering systems that I see in ImageBank or work through in relationship to ImageBank material, among other things. And DJ is also the biological product of this archive, which I'm hoping they will speak to a bit further in their own story. And then Shaunna is kind of the flip side of that mirror, which is the one who tries to maintain the order and tries to like stick with the system, just as we all challenge it. And I'm kind of like the borderline between the two. I'm not sitting in the middle, but that's that's sort of where my professional and my personal interests kind of like position me continuously is in that kind of like wavy, ambiguous borderline. Also important maybe for you to know is that like I was the interim head of arts and special collections for the last year, which essentially is 90% HR. But I did get to think through, what it means to be managing on a giant institutional level access to special collections material, which represents the lives of important literary and artistic figures, which was rewarding. But the main job that I have at University of Ottawa, what I'm tenured for, is helping researchers publish data. So using wide-scale, well, actually I sit on committees building national data infrastructure. And then I help researchers across all disciplines, so this includes medicine and law and physics, and to a lesser degree humanities researchers, helping them to use digital infrastructure to publish new data and share it internationally. That is probably enough of an introduction to me, and I think what I'd like to do now is just read this quote that was sent to me. So these are the people who sent me the quotes from the essay in the order that they're sent, and then in homage to the International Image Directory, Image Directory. We don't know who these quotes are from unless we look back at the list of the images. The first quote from the essay, and these are quotes that resonated with people when they read the essay. And this is, over many years, I've spent so much time thinking about this structural network, sifting through letters in archives and corresponding with Vincent, Michael, and other network personas. I'm not sure where my feelings lie. I'm transformed by these lists and the sensations of past and future community that they point to, but it's hard to say whether I'm in or out. So with that quote in mind, can we speak a little bit about how we fell into the ImageBank archive? Yes.
I don't think I could have ever gotten away from it if I tried, and I haven't tried very hard, and I'm always roped back in. So I guess I have a lot of archival kinship to it, but I also have a lot of family here, being raised on unceded Coast Salish territories in Vancouver, and being one of the few kids running around the Western Front. I have a relationship to this archive mostly in my professional sense as an art historian, because I worked with the work of Kate Craig for my master's thesis. I wrote about her Pink poem, and a lot of the ways in which I relate to this archive is just in the fact that I've been shaped by it so profoundly that, of course, I ended up being an art historian, having grown up around artists, and then I end up working around archives, having been around archives my entire life. So to come back to the image bank is really, I don't know, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. It's inimitable and an inevitable fact of my career at this point. But it's also a point of revisitation of the things that kind of keep us grounded in, you know, like the queer archive has been maybe even, you know, flogged past resuscitation at this point as an academic concept, but we keep coming back to it, and we keep coming back to systems that order our engagement. So I think that that's really important to think about when we engage with the archive conceptually, when we engage with a conceptual archive like the image bank, and when we talk about it from both a professional practice standards kind of view, which is Shaunna's purview, and a conceptual idea of the archive, which is more, you know, I'm very interested in that space where the two meet, and that's been the crux of a lot of my work, is like, how can we get Derrida and, you know, Terry Cook in the same room, right? We have this idea of what an archive is, but that often very much differs from day-to-day practice or from the high conceptual theory around the archive, and maybe the Belkin is where the two meet right now, and I think that's pretty interesting.
I love that. I didn't know you were going to say all that. So I'm Shaunna Moore, and I came to this archive as a student, actually. I was someone working at the Belkin in a student role right when I started my Master's of Archival Studies degree. So I, at that time, hardly knew what an archive was or what an archivist did. And I found this archive and really fell in love with it. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about the role of affect in, you know, coming to these types of collections and what that means to us. But to me, I found that it really changed my understanding of archival practice, in the sense that I didn't have a solidified view of what standard practice was, and instead I brought this, you know, experience with this kind of wild and unruly archive to my studies, and I found that it made me sort of argumentative in all of my classes, because I had this idea. You know, I was told this is what we do, this is what an archivist does, this is what an archive looks like, but I had this simultaneous experience of saying, you know, well, not always, like there are these archives that are very different. And so I think it really impacted my whole professional practice to take that experience with me, and instead of saying, you know, how can we impose this practice onto these, you know, unusual spaces, what can we learn from them to maybe expand what we think of as archives and our archival practice, and how can we approach it maybe with more creativity, which is, you know, I think what the Morris Trasov Archive really was, a starting place of creativity with an outgrowth of an archive, which is sort of a different sense than we usually get with traditional archives. So I feel like it's really very transformed the professional experience that I've had as an archivist. So I think I'll always have that little bit of love for it too.
I'm just wondering where the finding aid went.
Oh,
Yeah, where is it?
Where did
I
we-
was just thinking,
Mark
where is
it.
that?
I feel like this is a good time to bring out the finding aid.
Thank you.
So just, you know, like to raise the emerald curtain a little bit, like so this is not a functional finding aid. Okay, from a professional perspective, this is not what you want to be the access point in your archive. It's also not digitized, so you have to manually search it. Like, so typically, so I always think of or I've come to think. Actually, I stopped thinking about the image bank from an archive, or the Morris Trasov Archive conceptually as an archive. Like I was like, I'm just going to like parenthesize that and put it aside and only think about networks and think about the early 70s and how they were like circulating information in the early 70s and kind of what that did. That was kind of how I bracketed it so that I could look with it. And I guess live with that sense of like desire to engage with it. But part of the reason that I did that is because, so from a professional perspective, when you create a finding aid, and Shaunna, please feel free to speak more to this, but when you create a finding aid, you want to be succinct as possible in the description of the materials, and you kind of you want to respect like the original way that the people producing the material kind of put it all together, and how they thought about it and described it. But at the same time, from a practitioner perspective, like you're actually trying to make narratives out of the material in the archive. Often, if the people who made the archive are still alive, your access to the archive is through them. And so there's always this kind of like tension between the institutional layer, which I don't even think this is. I think this is the artist making the finding aid. And so it's not an institutional layer, it's an artist layer on top of the material that they've collected over a long time. And so this, for me, the image bank and its transition to an archive, the most interesting thing about it is what's your access point? Like when you come to the archive, like how do you get into it, and how much time do you spend with this, which is their voice telling you what to look at, and how much time do you spend with the artists, which is their voice telling you what to look at? So they're framing it the same way that they frame what they put into exhibitions. And how do you kind of like circumvent that framing, or think about a different kind of frame that you can put around something while also honoring the frames that they've created over time, because that's what brought you to it in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that I found really interesting about this archive is that it's only recently that it's been completely acquired. Yeah. And that's another huge professional like stumbling block because I don't know a single archive who would, well, okay, I do know a single archive. I know very few archives that would accept material that didn't have like a transfer of ownership when it came in the door, for many reasons that perhaps Shaunna can speak to.
Well, yeah, definitely. Just in terms of in terms of engaging with the work of the production of the archive, which many people don't really realize just how intensive archival practice is. You don't normally do that with materials that you don't own, because it's a big risk of loss there. And I think you're right about access and how this is it's a convoluted framework. It's an older framework though. We're coming to sort of new expectations about access through archives and new possibilities through databases and online forms that you can have different roads in and different connections can be made. And so we're always working on that. And I would say we're still working on that with this particular archive too. And then, but it's interesting because then in some ways this becomes a part of the archive rather than the infrastructure that sort of supports it and describes it. It kind of internalizes itself into becoming essential to the archive itself and like another object that we look at to kind of understand what's going on with the other objects.
I mean, I like the idea of becoming an object in the archive, of course, and like we can always think about how I don't know, Judith Butler, the Butler. They have a quote that they said they went off to university to go like to become a lesbian, and I think that there's actually like a fair amount of becoming and belonging that happens in terms of like looking at like queer archives, looking at the idea of this utopian queer futurity that people get really revved up about, especially with Image Bank and like things about color bar research and the Babyland work, considering that queerness is always on the horizon. It's always something in a state of becoming. It's not quite there yet, and it will be. And I think that when we look at the kind of circulation of objects, even considering the finding aid as an object within this archive, it kind of makes a lot of sense. It's almost it's maybe not cannibalizing its own information systems, but it's becoming part of it as it evolves, as it becomes part of the Belkin's holdings as well. Because when collections transfer, they all of a sudden have to get integrated into different information systems, and within those different information systems, things can get lost, things can get flagged, even if you preserve what archivists think of as original order. There is always a narrative that is preserved within that as well, right? So you're never quite getting a whole story with an archive, which I think is why we're still obsessed with them, right? It's like there's always ties, there's always lien to like different areas and different kinds of collections, and doing work with different material as it transfers ownership. When we think about archives, we have to think about how we access an archive, because we always need a person as a mediator or a structural system. There's always a mediated access. So I think of the archive as becoming, it allows for more expansive possibilities in that.
And I would say just about, it makes me think of that concept of a living archive, which this very much is, in the sense that, Michael and Vincent are here and they use the archives regularly and they transform it by their use. Like even for this show here, we're constructing the slideshow, and it means reordering. And like you're talking about with original order, it's like we care very much about that, except when something is constantly in use, it's reordered constantly. And then how do we capture all those moments in time to show the history of the archive as it continues to be used? It's incredibly challenging as an actual practitioner to do that work.
Perhaps I neglected to say earlier, but perhaps this is a good kind of point about access. We can do a Q&A at the end, but if you do have pressing points that you'd like to raise, often at events like this, there's people in the audience that carry memories with them or have relationships to the material or to the subjects that we're talking about, and subjects and objects and feelings that we're talking about. And so it's in this pandemic moment, it's a bit. We're thinking in real time about how to do these things, but there are microphones, so we can bring you a microphone if you maybe raise your hand and indicate that you have an urgent comment. But also please feel free to just call out from the audience. We're pretty flexy, yeah, bendy flexy. And then so here's another quote. That I think will follow up on this is, as one critic put it at the time, the directory is a material trace of artists who adopt art forms that reflect the lifestyles and communities in which they live and work. Read within the context of shifting geographies and sensations of belonging, their active list-making in a directory points to existing community. As an information system, it's also future-oriented. So what I'm talking about here is kind of the first iteration of when they gathered their request lists, these sheets of paper that had lists of addresses on them, and made them into a book. So a book has a kind of more authoritative feeling than a bunch of loose pieces of paper, so we can sort of see this as a formalizing of their power within the network as information kind of gatherers and transfers. So in this list of networks, in this list of addresses, you have many people with the benefit of the distance of time. If you understand kind of who is on the ground in Vancouver artistic communities or San Francisco artistic communities, LA, these sorts of places, you can sort of say, these are all the people who were, Michael and Vincent's friends, or that they knew, or that they wanted to send postcards to. But I remember a moment where I was sitting with Vincent and we were just out on the benches looking at the mountains out here. And I started to ask questions, what about this person? And what about this person? And I started to get these stories about, why they were included and who was included. And I realized in that conversation that they didn't already have pre-established relationships with all the people who were in the directory. Some of them they hadn't corresponded with or like entered into contact with at all. They were actually kind of these aspirational articulations of future potential relationships. And that kind of was a moment where I realized like, oh, this is actually not just documenting past existences, but actually like calling out into the future to create new possibilities. And then there's a second kind of layer of that, which is that, with each address there's an image request. And purportedly this reflects, the desires of the person being listed. But if they haven't yet encountered the person and established their desires, then what they're doing is imagining what their desires might be and sort of commenting on that person and their mediated relationship to that person in that act.
And I think this spoke to me in terms of the future-oriented sense, and I always come back to the sort of broader archive as a whole rather than talking just about the directory, but I think it has, in many ways, the same functions. I think when, in my experience with archives, typically when people start archives, we often think that it's this very past-focused activity, that it's sort of about solidifying something in the past, when really it usually is a very future-oriented job for a community to do, or where they're sort of, in some senses, wanting to make their identities and the representations of themselves known in the future. But I think there's an active shaping of the future that happens as an aspiration to establish an archive too, that there's that same forward-looking idea about, how can we make the future look how we want it in ways that it doesn't currently. So I think it's a very sort of political thing in those ways. And I really think it sort of parallels some of what the directory maybe was trying to do to establish those future connections. I think there's sort of a future connection sense of creating an archive that's also solidifying those relationships for changing how history will be understood.
I think that's so interesting though, because often you were just saying about making a description of an archive in the finding aid succinct as possible. What does that mean? Because if you look in terms of like queer revisitations of archival theory and stuff, an expanded descriptive practice is one of the most useful things you can do. Because if you have an expanded description, and if you use, like what Heather Love and Stephen Marcus call, like a rich description that sort of helps the process of world making become, even if the term description itself is much maligned in so much archival theory and work, it's like you need to be able to create a space for a bigger, expansive, and future-oriented description in which things can happen, in which future connections can be envisioned. And I think in a lot of archival practice, there's a real desire to sort of like make it that short paragraph, like that easy thing to read. But when we allow for more things to germinate, and even and this looks very different in different archival practices, but I think when we want to articulate a stake in a future, we need to allow it that kind of space as well. And I think that the Morris Trasov Archive really pushes back against sort of boundaried walls, but that doesn't always happen in exhibition spaces. So it's quite interesting how we see like objects come in and circulate, while we can think of the archive as like this expansive operational network with different nodes and outward reaching, desire, really. And like that's so much of what articulates where we go in the archive. I talk a lot in my work about the embodied queer like archivist and researcher as one person who is activated by like lines of desire that sort of lead us to the objects and the people and the events in the archive that we then kind of make a larger queer genealogy in the archive. And that really works for me specifically, but whenever I go into an archive, I know that I'm going to be pointed in one direction or another. Mm-hmm. And it's mostly because of my own desire that I go towards this or that. So I think that it's it's quite interesting to talk about like future articulations of this kind of desire without necessarily knowing about it. Now, although, I'm thinking about communities and how you talk about that, and now I kind of want to see, you know, what happens if we send out postcards now to those addresses, right?
Yeah, that act of, well, we were talking about this as being operational in Ray Johnson's practice too. So, to me, I see it as the image bank practice of like inventing correspondence and then kind of entering into contact with people who may not have anticipated it, is sort of an echo of the Ray Johnson kind of like move. So what boundaries are you crossing if you start sending people material that may or may not resonate with them? And I do remember, okay, so just back to this, I'm going to kind of like bring a couple of threads together here with an anecdote, but this question of how do you have a larger, more expansive kind of like relationship to an archival, to a corpus of material that has, different access points that exist, but they might not be the access points that that kind of allow you to pursue your own desires within the corpus of work, right? And so for me, the way that the access points that I ended up having were all the different kind of publications and letters that I could find in other archives that were being constituted at the same time that the Trasov Archive covers. So going into Roy Kuka's transcanthal letters, which are published letters, but then going into Roy Kuka's archive and then realizing how much work he had done on those letters before he published them, and then also going into the General Idea font and looking for the letters that General Idea had sent back to ImageBank, because ImageBank has where Michael and Vincent have very conveniently put together all the ImageBank letters, and it's a great read, right? But you only have one side of the correspondence. And then if you go into the National Gallery and you read through the other side of the correspondence, all of a sudden you have these, kind of a multi-dimensional kind of thing happening. And so it allows you to go back and forth between all these different fonts. I mean, you have to travel, and it takes a lot of time, all of these things, but it does sort of create more of an expansive description, and you get a much more kind of textured idea of the queer lived lives that were being articulated in this space at the time, and also a much more expansive understanding of what queerness might have been in that moment.
We were talking about yesterday about Bill C-150 too, right? It's at a particular moment in which there is an ostensible quote-unquote decriminalization of homosexuality as a total addendum. It was not about that at all. It was about, really sort of decriminalizing. It was an omnibus bill, so there was, selected instances in which abortion and divorce and, sex acts could be no longer recognized as criminal. But the other side of that is that all of a sudden there was more spotlight socially on gay sex acts and sex in public and traditional kind of cruising values at the time. And there's been a lot of work recently on how that changed and didn't change. I remember when we got that gay loony last year or 2019, the lost year, we got the gay money. It wasn't as satisfying, it didn't really say much about an actual history, and it just kind of glossed over the fact again. It's the same sort of palatable Canada, which is instituted and based on systems of genocide and white supremacy, and really legislatively is continuing to crouch behind this sort of facade. And when we get that multidimensional feel from different sides, from different letters, albeit very restricted access, because it does have a lot of barriers in terms of money, travel, time, this kind of access, it brings it out of that two-dimensional finding aid and into a three-dimensional reality. So I think that there's so much richness which we can't always capture within an archival mode, and you know, therein lies the rub. I think that there's a certain amount that can always be told, or that we can always be seen through like the documents and images that we have, especially within the archive. And then there's always going to be a dimension that's lost as well. Sort of pessimistic view on it a little bit.
Well, but you know, typically archival procedures and standards are not very aspirational, right? Like you say, it's like, how concise can I make this thing? And it's hard to make all of the connections when you're talking about a print form. We've only begun to experiment with possibilities of, you know, how we can manage webs of connections online in ways that are, you know, understandable and navigable for people. And so I think it's too just changing that idea of, I think archivists tend to, you know, learn a body of theory and come and try to plunk it on top of everything. And really, like, you know, the concept of a network even gives us so many opportunities to rethink how we could create those connections as sort of, I don't know, a finding aid or however that might look, you know, in a different form online. It's more taking the inspiration, I guess, from the archives themselves and the communities rather than the starting place of the procedure and applying it the other way.
So just following from that, queer futurity eschews kinship structures resembling monogamous couplings and models of biological reproduction that reinforce heteronormative notions of family and social status. Instead, it embraces a temporally indeterminate cessation of belonging. This state of queer futurity is enabled through image banks' address lists as one affective relationship to place dissolves, while the list of addresses opens up a series of undefined future possibilities for connection. So I was just thinking about the shift in legal status, you know, that happens all at once. And, you know, it's also happening kind of on the after, the echoes of the 60s and the early 70s and you know, the sexual revolution, women's lib, and all this sort of thing. And how this gets expressed in the material that we can find in the Morris Trasov Archive, right? And it's not necessarily all produced by them, but it's like collected by them, right? And it may or may not get exhibited by them or recirculated by them. And so one of the things that I found fascinating, and this is partially because I live in a certain like state of ambiguity in my own kind of life and queerness, but what I found really fascinating was when I finally realized that the structure of the directory arguably comes from a list of like international gay-friendly spaces that was sent by Ray Johnson to Michael in the 60s. And so here is like an ordering principle for the directory that's all about covert information networks. If you're not going to find people who are like you or who will live like you unless you have access to this like secret list. And you're not going to know what this secret list is unless you're kind of already in the life. And so that was like kind of a moment where I could really kind of like read or think about the directory in a totally different way. And start to look for signifiers that would tell me who else was reaching out in that way. They're not reaching out to me, or I'm not necessarily invited into this list because I'm not I'm not like looking for men. But that was a way of thinking about the directory in terms of the kind of like futurity that it was imagining. But it's also imagining it in relationship to a shifted legal status. So like the judicial kind of framework is changing, but the actual lived experience of life is not changing. And then I also was thinking about how like the women in the network were also experiencing a shift in their experiences, and how that is or is not kind of like evidenced or found, like findable in in the archive. And for me, like I'm hoping that DJ will speak a little bit about Cape Craig because that's kind of DJ's area. But for me, like having some really resonant conversations with Carol Litter was really important for my understanding of what that might have been like to actually physically live next to Image Bank while they're romping at Babyland and like setting up images of like challenging like the family structures, but like the oppressive family structures of the 50s, right? So challenging that by setting up their sets at Babyland, and kind of finding a space where they can experience that desire, and then having people like Richard Coleman come in from Coach House in Toronto, and kind of like creating these networks all over the place. But then Carol Litter kind of like being part of the economic structure that allowed for this to take place because she's also buying a share into Babyland. But then not necessarily being able to fully realize her own dream to have a space to like live in nature and write and raise her daughter, right? And so it's very interesting that there are these like competing visions of like futurity or desire for a different way of living. And they're living next to each other and they're dependent on each other like economically for the production of their future. But Carol Litter kind of like stops participating in their network at a certain point. Like you can just see like she kind of drops out. There is an artist book that she did in the 80s that kind of like alludes to this, like a really nice little Xerox kind of conceptual artist book that tells the story of this. But we don't see it, right? Like I found it in the SFU collection because I was there for Raikuka's stuff.
Yeah, I mean the stuff that you find when you're looking elsewhere, right? You're like looking, as a colleague of mine talks about seeing something out of the corner of their eyes quite often and being really attracted to that as a desire line. And I think that there is a significant amount of slippage in the archive of what you think you're looking for and then what you end up looking for. And I found that when I was doing my master's research, I had to come back and look at Kate's archive of stuff, which was not yet collected by the Belkin and would not be collected by the Belkin until it was all like organized and cataloged for them as a precursor, as a preliminary. But I found elements and papers in her archive that were originals of things that were copies in the Western Front archive that had been collected by UBC Special Collections 20 years prior. So I think that there's a certain amount of it's give and it's also like shifting the balance of who we're looking at. And this is the question that people have been asking of art history for the past 30 years. It's a question that was even asked by Linda Nochlin in 1971. Why have there been no great women artists? And it comes back again and again and again. And it's kind of somewhat boring that we have to keep coming back to this again and again and again. But the fact of it is, you even allude to it you talk about it in your essay when you say that, like Lady Brute was the typesetter for the image directory, and we don't see her really appearing so much, although we do have images from like the file cover, and there are images of her, but they do come back as circulating objects rather than an active presence. And when I was looking at her archive, there were all kinds of things that sort of alluded to her mitigated practices within the archive and how it worked. She would hold down the front, so to speak, and like collect that archive and work day to day so that the Western Front kept going while a bunch of different people were able to come and go as they please, right? So there was a steadfast presence needed to sort of make sure things were still operational, and that seems to be a level at which a lot of the women who participated in Image Bank came in and stayed. It's an operational and a functional level, which is quite interesting because we'll come to that more later, but it really it becomes a site again of a little bit of absence, and of course there's always ways to talk about that. I found in her archive recipes for making sure that like for I'm totally blanking on the word now, but to stimulate menstruation early so you could avoid getting pregnant. I found in her journals ideas for videos and distinct scene plans that were never realized, and that if they were, they would have had a real kind of, I mean, maybe not cataclysmic, but definitely really effective key on there. I wrote an article for Canadian Art a couple years ago about a video that she never did, in which she gets like stimulated to orgasm by a vibrator, and maybe there's like a cat there too, and that's kind of like there's her own sexual separation from, you know, other members of the network, which preceded, you know, her taking off the Lady Brew costume for the final time in '75. So I think that there's so much to be seen when we take a look from a different angle, and maybe when we make sure that there is more levels of access available and we can see all of that. But again, it's about a coordination of several different networks.
Mm-hmm.
So I think now it's the challenge of looking at these things again and seeing, like, what can we do now? What can we do now that we have a somewhat canonical view of all of this work 50 years later, right? 51 years later. And I think that that's the work that we can be doing now, right? And looking at how, you know, the production of all of these, even of these zines, I'm really interested to see how the zine culture of like queerness in the 70s really relates to a very contemporary, thriving queer zine culture. I think that we can move forward with kind of images around that maybe, you know, include lots and can still reach forward.
I guess to come back to the list of gay places and looking for things, I think it's another sort of example of the ways that archival practices can either sort of obscure meaning in things or illuminate it. I remember a time when Michael and Vincent were looking for the list of gay places in the archive, right?
Is it there?
It's a pretty important thing. It is, but it's not what I thought. So I'd only ever seen it reproduced, I think in the Ray Johnson catalog. And so it looks like it's a full page, right? And so I was looking for this full page, typing in, you know, list of gay places, like, you know, just how do I find this thing? And I actually discovered it weeks later, and I don't even know how I did, but it was so different than what I thought it would be. It's like 10 by 10 centimeters, like this big, and all tattered, like it had been in, you know, someone's pocket forever, which maybe it had. And the title of it is just international, and so, you know, the standard archival practice would have you transcribe that title. And so when you're looking for something called international, it's like you're not going to find the list of gay places. And I think it's, you know, but it was meant to be, like you say, a secret sort of document, and I think archival practices don't deal very well with secrets, right? And so it's like, how can we revisit that in a new way that you know, kind of forgets about what we're told, you know, a title needs to be or a description needs to be, because, I mean, apart from finding that piece, you kind of need to have that whole story to understand what it was. Like, I don't know how anyone would see that document in and of itself and make any meaning out of it, right?
I also wonder if like we couldn't catalog it that way until now. Right? Like it wasn't within our kind of social and imaginary to be able to describe it that way.
Probably.
In an institutional collection.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems really strange to say, but I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised. But I do feel like I've always thought of the archive, like the Morris Trasov Archive and their archival practice and their archival kind of performance, its performance, as like a mirror image of an archive. And which is kind of consistent with how their creative practice works. And so it's going to be what you think it should be, like in reverse. And so it's almost like, and I don't think, like, is it in that finding aid? Because I don't know, you know, like how is it described in that finding aid? Because it's almost like if we could figure out how it was described in that finding aid, then maybe we'd figure out that this was like the mirror image finding aid and not actually the institutional finding aid, and then we'd be able to start to like really decode.
But the mirror image finding aid is always the gay one. It's always the gay finding aid, because what you do when you look, I call this like the work of like first generation queer historians, people like Jim Kepner, who did the one archives in LA, and Joe Nessel of the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, right? Like they would comb and they would search for like weird descriptors and like bachelors or bosom friends, you know, like these sort of like codes and titles that would denote super gayness that is no longer in use, right? Like now we would be like a lesbian couple, or, you know, like we would have a list of gay places instead of international. And now that we have the list of gay places as the title, there's a whole other set of problems of going back and like looking at it and what do these things mean? Like now that we have bachelors, now that we have all of this, we also have another set of language, right? If we look back at like basically the transgender archives of the University of Victoria, which is one of the biggest trans archives around, we have all kinds of different descriptions. You know, like some people are transsexual, some people are transvestites, some people are cross-dressers, CDs, TDs, all of these things. And as I look back and I go further, there are always going to be other clues, and there are always going to be the internationals that we're not going to be able to find. And I think that's what it is that mirror image. That's always the queerness that we're looking for in the archive that we can't quite find. That's also how we stumble on the greatest things, right? It's like, how do you find that tattered card?
Well, and maybe that's the changing role of the archivist too, kind of like what you're saying, like could we describe that any differently in the past? I think the archivist was traditionally intended to be a very neutral figure, like an impartial person who is representing, you know, this is an object. And so if you're trying to interpret it in a contemporary sense, that's a whole different role that we're being asked now to enact, which is like a really important one, because otherwise, like you say, it's totally obscure to most people what a bachelor is, you know, in that context.
It also has to do with being like an initiate to the language, and just to kind of come back to this question of like, what is the role of Kate Craig, or what is the role of the women in the network? I'm just thinking through, you know, I mean, my list of archivists that I encountered, like it's all women, and you know, archivists, librarians, these are feminized professions. These are caretaker roles, and I think there's work to do to think about caretaker roles in relationship to this archive and to in relationship to multiple artists' archives. But it also makes me think about how like that mirror image kind of like mode. Also, maybe it's time to kind of think through a different mode, right? Like you know, if we like maybe there are things that we can learn from trans studies, and maybe we need to think about what the figure of Pascal kind of does to this network. I can't really take it any further than that today, but that's sort of one of the questions that has come up for me in the last month of talking with the both of you.
And I love that idea of the caretaker role. Like, I really think that's the future direction of archival work, is approaching it from the caretaker role, because I think it just creates such a different relationship to the records and the creators, and trying to understand what they're saying to us, you know, like coming at it from a place of asking questions, like we would of a friend, you know, instead of saying, well, I'm a professional and I apply this to this context, I'm coming at it from more of a relationship mode, like it's a lover or a friend that you're asking, like, tell me about yourself, or tell me what you want to be called, or, you know, those kinds of questions that I don't think we're very trained to ask in these professions.
I would also argue that maybe the relationship needs to be recognized. That it's not like, because you know, as a feminized profession, what happens is that caretaker role is kind of pushed into the background and it's not acknowledged. It's treated as neutral or invisible. And so perhaps like moving forward, what needs to be done is like acknowledging that the archivist, whoever that is, also has a narrative role in relationship to this archive and in relationship to Michael and Vincent and everybody else who shows up to look at it.
Well, I think that it's really interesting because in my research I found that there has been like and Shaunna, like please help me out with this. There's been a paradigm shift in which like the neutral figure of the archivist is has been at least disturbed. It's at least, you know, pushed a little bit, because for a long time it seems as though archival standards and profession was, no, we're neutral, we have truth with a capital T, and we are the guardians of the truth. And I mean, like, to a certain degree, of course, that is true, but it's always a mediated truth, right? And it's always the narrative that is privileged is the narrative that you get, right? And it's really hard to fight this like neutral archivist image. It's like you're supposed to take care of it and put it in its Mylar folder and, you know, like make sure it's okay. But in the end, you know, those people have relationships with all of these documents as well. And in recognizing those relationships and talking about those relationships, we can dispel some of that kind of mystery, right? And we can open up these sort of narrative paths that go beyond what we're presented with, because that's when we can make lateral connections, like across collections, you know, in a institution that has many different research collections, making those lateral jumps and seeing which materials connected to this other collection and vice versa. I think that's where we can really start to build out more of these sort of intra-system connections, for sure.
Excuse me, but you're an historian, aren't you, DJ?
I'm an art historian, yes.
Yes, okay, these are archivists, so really what's interesting to me is you're making history of the work that they're doing. So the question is, when you talk about their own less than neutral caretaking, are they creating a narrative also? Are you
Am I narrativizing their narrative?
No.
You're so instrumentalizing.
But are you also creating narratives within your own archival forms? Because my understanding through both historians and art historians is they love archives because they can make then new historical or new narrative. And so my question really is for the archivist, not for you, DJ. Is, are you also making a kind of narrative in the sense of your caretaking in the way you make connections?
I think absolutely. I think it's inevitable to think that you can describe something in a neutral way, and really the only way in, if you search a database online, you're entering certain words, and whatever the archivist has chosen to represent the item with whatever words, that's, you're going to find it or not. And so, you know, you have those opportunities to, I think, take things in new directions. And so I think it is definitely creating a narrative that may not have been there before. So that's, I think, you know, it also opens up the possibility of then, should we be trying to create multiple narratives, like lots of layers on top with different people describing each thing, and, you know, having lots of ways into the same record. Which is kind of what we do with history, like what you're saying. You know, it used to be this idea of history as like, this is the history, and we don't really think that way anymore. And so I think it's kind of the same thing with archival practice.
Can I actually interject on that? Because having, like, I love this conversation about the caretakers of the archive, and also about a very feminized profession, the whole thing. One of the things that I loved, having actually worked on the description of the archive, is that there were so many other like lovely people working on it at the exact same time, but also over like many years. And so one of the things that I found in terms of like thinking about that kind of narrativizing, or thinking about the future researcher, the future reader of these records, of these descriptions that I was making, and I was always like trying to make it succinct, but I like got worse and worse. Like, as I kept working on it, I was like just adding like more and more stuff, because the thing that happens when you have so many people working on these records and working on these descriptions is that like you learn from each other across like time and outside of yourself, and you're able more and more to learn not only from the object but from everybody's other records. And so I think in some way, like you're not narrativizing it in terms of putting it into a sort of story in itself, but each object becomes this like funny accretion of the more and more that each of these caretakers is learning. And then also of that person thinking to the future and thinking like, who will read this thing that I'm working on so hard? Like, I'm so excited. I want them to find what they're looking for and also find what they're not looking for, like that thing that comes out of the corner of your eye. So I think that that's, I think, one of the greatest pleasures of this archive is like not only learning from Michael and Vincent, but from everybody who's ever touched it in these different ways and offered like more perspectives on it that are just like found in those records if you kind of keep looking at them. So,
I think that's why I always, as a historian, I want a colophon. I want one of those. I want detailed accounts of who was looking at it and who put what here. And I argue for that in my work because that's how I, it would be so lovely to see who is working on it for what reason. But also why things like information specialists like Felicity can promote like user-initiated flags and stuff like that, especially when you're working with archives that maybe have a lot of information that lots of people can pick at too. Like I love the idea of users being able to flag content and talk about like different kinds of tags and put their own mark on it. Then again, I'm a historian.
I'm still a really big believer in bibliographies. Like I really think, I mean, the thing is that it takes time to kind of really sit down and read them and kind of trace I'm also a print culture historian, and so I really work through bibliographic tunnels. So it is essentially doing that work of going through the flags, except the flags are in the writing. And but it's just that like our attention spans are different now, right? And the way that we interact with the media that we kind of like learn our history from is different. And so we look for the tags in the digital infrastructure rather than like spending the time to go through the bibliography and the footnotes, which is how we would have done that like 10 to 15 years ago. Just coming back to the question about like, are you narrativizing? Like as an archivist or as a librarian, are you narrativizing? So I managed a collection. Like I fell into the ImageMake kind of like network because I was managing some of that material at our text in Montreal. And I think at that point I was probably, I had an artistic practice and I was, publishing this little assemblage magazine with a collective. We did this for about 20 years, and I found ImageMake, and I sort of felt like an artistic kinship with it, and I wanted to know more about it. But I wasn't a historian. I didn't understand theory, and then but I wanted to be better at it, and so I did a PhD, and I wrote some pretty kick-ass shit. There's like an essay in here, but pretty much everything that we're talking about today is also in my PhD thesis, which kind of makes an intervention in the Vancouver corpus by talking about ImageMake in relationship to like national culture at that time, rather than looking to the international, right? And it's absolutely like a personal narrative too. And there's also like a fairly significant essay that's in Canadian Literature Journal. All of these things are very accessible. You can go read them if you want. These are absolutely like personal narratives that are also about me trying to figure out like I guess my own kind of like artistic genealogy, my own relationship to like whatever the heck Canadian culture is. I also like have British citizenship, and so I feel an affiliation to Michael in that sense. Like, and essentially what that brings me to is to start thinking about like whiteness. What is whiteness in Canadian culture? What is my relationship to that? What is my responsibility? And then what can I learn from the practice of Image Bank and others at that time, Canadian Centennial, to think through how whiteness is constructed in visual arts. Yeah.
This is a very good note.
Possibly time to move to Live by Stripes.
Briefly, and then, we should open it up after that, I think.
Yeah. Oh, but we have a question, comment, yes.
Yeah, I love this conversation. I love everything you say about the archive. It's making me so excited about how you do finding things, DJ. And I think my questions around subjectivity and desire have been answered by your conversation. I was curious. I have a couple questions, so I can go through them all at once, or we can circle back. But and a disclaimer: I still use binders, so I just want to say about binders. I wanted to go back to Shaunna. You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation this idea of the role of affect in approaching collections, perhaps both as an archivist and maybe as a researcher. And then these lovely quotes that Felicity's putting up about sensation and that sensation of belonging or that encounter. Like, it's a very affective thing, and I was just curious. I guess my first question is around historical veracity for a living archive. Like, what is your relationship as an archivist or as an art historian to historical veracity, especially archives like these, like we've seen, that incorporate so much play, or as you mentioned, like Michael and Vincent will come back and then like rearrange things or annotate. So I guess that's my first question. And then the other was more around like digitization. Like, how has digitization both allowed you to like maybe make those cross connections that DJ you're talking about, and what's the balance between like we talk about what's lost, what is gained, or absence, presence, but kind of curious about like how you've found in your own archival practices, like what is gained when there is perhaps a tactile loss. I know Felicity mentioned.
I guess to start with your question about veracity, I think it's always problematic, and certainly, even in relation to this archive, there were objects that were described differently by different people with a different story attached to them. And I don't think I have a really good answer for that, because how do you choose, right? If someone says this happened this date and someone else says it happened in this other date, and here's the whole story behind the creation of this specific thing, the only way I really see, and maybe it comes back to the multiple narratives thing, where you say, there are these two layers, instead of saying, as an archivist, I'm going to decide and I'm going to create a singular description, maybe we leave it, because I think historians have always had to make those judgment calls, and so maybe we just present the stories and let the veracity sort of come out through connections to other things when people discover, because that would often also happen. You discover other corroborating sources and you say, oh, well, actually it was this date and this event and blah, blah, blah. And so I think it's always tricky. I don't have a very good answer for that, honestly. What about you, Felicity, does that?
I think I need you to repeat the question. I'm sorry. I'm like feeling like jet lag.
Oh, I think the first one was more in relation to like affect.
Affect. Okay. So in terms of affect, I just think that, back to the impartiality thing, archivists have always been assumed to not have, and actually that an affective relationship was a bad thing, that you shouldn't be invested in what you're describing. You should maintain almost like a professional distance that they talk about in relation to being a doctor or social worker or something else, right? Where you're not like all bound up in these stories. And I think there's sort of a change to embracing that sort of web of connections that we have when we get really embedded in an archive. And I think anyone that has done a lot of archival research would say that you get, it feels like you have friends there, because you read, letters back and forth between people over the course of their whole lives. How do you not feel sort of invested in that life, right? So I think it's more maybe embracing something that was always there and saying, how can we use this to our advantage by asking these new questions and talking about it in a new way with an understanding of that we really care about these things and we care about these people that we've never met, and the subject matter, like it matters to us how we describe it, what kind of words we use, and that kind of thing. Does that kind of answer what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I think my second question was more around tactility and digitization. So how is digitization, say, opened up, DJ mentioned the finding aid, and how you can make a kind of concise and elegant description that both points outward to these, extensions, so that the reader understands, like, okay, this is for this purpose, but it extends outward. And then I was just curious, thinking about like digitization of archives and how that allows for potentially more cross connections, but maybe removes the tactile encounter of, say, Morris Trasov Archive.
For the first question, I also just want to acknowledge that there are really huge queer caucuses in the library and archives profession. Like, we get together, talk about all these things, and often it's a question of fitting the right archivist to the archive, right? So there may be all these queer feelings and relationships happening, but you're not necessarily the steward of the archive that would benefit from it, right? And then the other thing that it occurs to me is that often that work, again, is invisible, and so they're not necessarily going to write an essay about it, or they're not necessarily going to be able to employ the labor power, because there's a huge labor deployment to rewrite finding aids and change the keywords and digitize and make connections. And so often that won't be possible, but what they are able to do is slip the right paper to the right person when they walk in the door. And that kind of moment where the right, DJ walks in and you're like, oh, you know which letters you have to read? And if you're very lucky, then you get your name in the acknowledgments of the book or something like that, right? When really, if you think about it, you should be a co-author or something if you're creating that many kind of but that's not how the humanities work. We elevate the single author, right? Do you want me to answer the second question first? And then for the digitization, the other thing I just want to say from a technical perspective, again, this is labor, right? It's huge deployments of labor to digitize in a meaningful way. And even the Vancouver in the 60s project, I think, is a good example of that. We have some really lovely little sound bites that kind of get put up, but they conceal as much as they reveal. And they're, visually luscious, but they don't necessarily, and they give you the impression that you're following the narrative that you want to follow, but you're not. You're still following the structural narrative of whoever put that stuff up there and how it was described. So it's just repeating the same kind of systemic problematics. But there are ways that are on the horizon. I know people are talking about it, but really what we need to be doing is putting our efforts towards doing linked open data, which is super not sexy. It doesn't give you beautiful websites, but what it does do is maximize the labor deployed to describe the documents across multiple collections, and then allow them to be exported into something like Wikidata, and then you can the machine does the work of finding the stuff for you. But it's just not hot in a visual arts kind of a way. Lorna, you had a
Yeah, I
comment.
just wanted to make a couple comments because I think what you're describing, whether it's narrativizing, et cetera, I I think what's being described is a sense of distributed or dispersed authorship that can open up, but an unacknowledged kind of authorship. And then secondly, talking about the invisibility or the invisibility of Cape Craig for so many years, and the rest of it was that what is studied is valued. So the practice that you are doing by attending to and paying attention is amplifying the value of particular archives, whereas others are just not attended to. And they're so, of course, as you pointed out, and it's so obvious, the membership lists of the Western Front that Cape Craig so, diligently attended to is not thought of on the same register of value as other kinds of stuff. And so I'm really fascinated by this idea of if all of us kind of consider ourselves in the role of author, then not only is it more likely that that work be acknowledged and not dismissed based on the diminished idea of caretaking, but also allows the viewer, allows the visitor to the archive, allows the visitor to the online database to consider themselves in that role of actively making an additional story or another layer in that dispersed archive. And just as you were saying about the elevating the individual is something that feminist analysis has been trying to undermine and reimagine for a very long time. Is really, I think, the intentionality around it. And I have that feeling around how, say, curation, people are talking about it as a kind of a caretaking thing, which is true and is good, but we need to think about care in a more active and less just receptive kind of way. And this dispersed authorship, goes beyond curators, archivists, art historians. I mean, it's Claudia, collectors. That's another form of authorship in terms of how, materials are brought together with an intentionality and a chronology and a voice. So just wanted to add that.
Those are all excellent points. And I think like we're here in the framework of Image Bank, right? So that's what we're talking about. That's what we're putting the spotlight on. That's where we're giving value. And then when we are able to talk about things that are like in relation to it, we have to talk about it through Image Bank, right? I think I'm pretty sure that is. Well, I know it's a source of ambivalence for pretty much everybody on this panel. And I think definitely the people that I know and I named kind of at the beginning of this, a lot of what we share is a feeling of ambivalence in relationship to the work that we do with this archive and with this material. And
just to add that it actually is a network.
Yeah.
And in itself is a kind of dispersed authorship because it really is, it's an archive of networkedness, right?
Which is very difficult to capture, I think, in an archive, right? Because then you have the object which has a creator associated with it, but then you have the layer of Michael and Vincent's archiving process that has contextualized it in a new way. And like you said, Francesca, all these people over the years. And so it's like just millions of layers and connections that you're trying to capture. which is really fun, but also very challenging.
And it also comes to like this thinking of through network theory, like what does a network do? It's not really distributed and non-hierarchical. There are actually power dynamics within a network, and you know, we see this with Facebook. We see this with like the social networks are like acting it out in real time with us now. But this has always been property of networks, and which is essentially the more the information flows through a single node, the more power that node has. And what that node does with the power may or may not be intentional, but the more that there's an accumulation in a particular kind of like connecting point, the more powerful it is. And ImageBank was powerful in this network. And there are dynamics to that power. And one of the dynamics is this. Which is kind of a long.
I mean, like pick a choice.
Yeah.
Nugget.
Yeah.
Or something. Not the whole thing.
No.
It's too long.
Okay, so the theory of Levi-Strauss is kind of like an underpinning kind of like mode for ImageBank, and so it's anthropological. It's based in kind of binary thinking, and as in the linguistic model of modern society proposed by Levi-Strauss, in the correspondence network, men reproduce themselves through media transmission, and women are assigned the role of commodities represented by their circulating images. So there's a way that you can read their network, or the power dynamics of the network, in the sense that you don't need women to reproduce society anymore, because you don't need like children. Children are no longer the future, right? Like your future is not based on this premise that you have to do it for the children. You can reproduce your network by circulating images and attracting new people to your culture through images, so it's possible to look at the images of Kate Craig, for example, that are circulating as kind of these like fashion fetish icons that are circulating and that help reproduce the culture that's being created through their circulation and their attraction of new people. Which is why somebody like Carol Itter might have dropped out when she had a child.
I mean, I think it's also it's this continuing cycle that we have around. I was almost gonna say like let's just leave Levi-Strauss where he is, but I mean, I think that when we think about structural anthropology and how Levi-Strauss specifically as a very, very important cultural figure of the 20th century, someone who we can't just be like, oh, Levi-Strauss, but he did spend time in Vancouver around here, and he worked thinking about and perhaps not totally understanding the cultures of this land, and like how he even said in a documentary after he completed his first he had these government funded trips to BC that were funded by Canada and France, and he once said even that it's possible that this area of the world was the very beginning of life because it has a primordial like supernatural power to it, and his anthropology being an underpinning of a lot of what we consider to be great Canadian art now. Like we have a lot of Western Front theory, some ImageBank as well, Robert Fillieux, a lot of Fluxus. Even there was another artist we were talking about the other day who talks about Levi-Strauss in his work. In any event, this kind of idea of these binary systems understanding mythical thought, it no longer suffices. It no longer, cuts the mustard. Anthropologically, or in terms of how we think about society now, or even in terms of gender and transgressions of gender that could maybe open up different experiences. If there were ways beyond a reproduction through media instead of through, like specifically biologically reproducing parts that people have, people of all genders, right? And I think that it's really important now to expand on this and be like, yeah, of course the things need to be accounted for in mythical thought, and Levi-Strauss had a lot to contribute to that. but it's now a moment in which we can sort of step out of that that very structural anthropology view of it, especially when we're speaking from UBC, right? MOA is just down the road, and we have an extremely important Canadian history to learn here, you know, like in the late 19th century with the salvage paradigm anthropology, when anthropologists from all over the world were competing for the resources of a population that was under constant threat by the national government as well, right? And when we think about these kind of relationships, you know, Levi-Strauss is funded by the Canadian and French governments to come over and lecture and explain supernatural mythology of peoples from this land, of the Kwakwaka'wakw people. You know, like, we have to continue to think about these kinds of relationships when we do this work, because of course all of these artists from this period in time are influenced by their surroundings. There's no way to get out of that, which is also the paradigm shift in archives, is that we can't get away from our surroundings. There's no way to sort of dispel the relationships that we have, no matter if we want to keep an arm's length. And I think that that's, you know, what I keep coming back to with this material, is that I grew up around all of these people, and I'm always going to have that relationship with it. But I also want to step outside of that and sort of see where we can go with it now that we've got 51 years of Image Bank, and moving forward, we can also expand out and look at what we can do next with it. Now we can look at, you know, the sort of points of notes where Indigenous arts kind of also enter an international scene at this point in time as avant-garde. Now we can go in that direction and look at new material.
Yeah, that.
I'm excited for that.
As am I. So this is one of the kind of absences of, I mean, if you're looking for BIPOC practices in Image Bank, like, you're going to be disappointed. But rather than trying to like fill the absences, right, which is like our kind of like our MO is like, oh, there's something missing, let's go find it, or let's find something exemplary to like fill that gap, and then we don't have to worry about that absence anymore. I do think that there's like a lot of potential that hasn't been explored in the network that Image Bank is like one part of a much larger, expansive field of production that is international. And I think that one of the things that would be really exciting going forward is to see when an engagement with Indigenous practices and global Indigenous practices are kind of like found in the archive, because they are there. It's just that they're like very problematic and quite tone deaf, like from the perspective that we have in the present. And so in the same way that there was like this reckoning with the European surrealists and their engagement with Northwest Coast practices, like there's some really interesting kind of thinking that can be done around the role of primitivism in the neo-surrealist work that is captured in this archive, and you know what that work was symbolic to the artists who were practicing at that time through modes that like kind of abstracted those practices into process, into kind of spiritual relationships to nature. You know, like, so there's an engagement, but it's an abstraction. And I think we don't know much more about that at this time, because that work hasn't yet been done. Thoughts?
We should do it.
Yeah.
We should get to it.
Do you have thoughts? Are there thoughts from the audience?
One observation I'd like to make, you know, when you talk about looking back on this material, is, and you use the word longing and looking into the future. I think that on the occasions that I was in the room, it didn't feel like looking to the future. It felt like being present in a way that had never been possible. And I think mentioning Kate's, her lists and everybody else's list, one of the most important aspects of the time or these experiences was the fact that it was, you know, the Image Bank list, the address list, Kate's membership list, that sense of belonging, Avalanche, these magazines, flash art, actually putting the the directory, the flash art directory, together. And there was, it didn't feel to me anyway that everybody was longing for something that was going to come into being. And I think if there's a real message from the past in terms of this archive, it's very much about what comes out of being intensely present and being and connected. That connectedness, you know, we're sitting here with our phones, that wasn't available. If I wanted to call my mother, it cost $30 for 3 minutes, and so I couldn't. And this, being able to reach out to people, and it wasn't even about wanting to have somebody's address so you might be able to build a relationship with them. By having the address, you had the relationship. And I think it's a very, very important lessons about ways of being and ways of organizing and about chance. I ended up in videos because I happened to walk through the building, and I just happened to be there, and they needed a body. And this notion of chance is also about being open. Whoever was there was seen as having something valuable to offer, and it didn't have to conform, and it didn't have to be organized. In fact, it was the enormous resistance of it. And I've always been promising myself that one day I'd write an article about LIP grants. And I don't know if you know anything about them, but they were called Local Initiative Programs. And they were called the funny money grants, because you didn't have to have a solid idea to get money. It was Trudeau's great grant. And organizations like Pumps and all these, so many of the artist fund centers, they didn't have to have a program, they had to just be, and you could apply for money and you could get it, and eventually everybody thought it was disgraceful how the money was being spent. But these are great lessons in how to be intensely present, connected, open, and so free in a way that has, in many cases, been lost. And this is the challenge that you're facing, because the challenge that you're facing is your tasks of working with an archive is about organization, and you mentioned right earlier on the problem of the attitude towards whether or not the archivist is present. And I've had a situation where I did a show that was all archive-based. It was my first major exhibition. And I really need to redo it, because I thought that my most important role was to be absent, and that any interference on my part in terms of being too present, too controlling the narrative. We've been talking a lot about narratives. And that absence of that voice has meant that all these years later, the information has not been available. Because of my working so intensely with a particular archive, which had extremely important information about it, contained in it. And I didn't want to impose myself. I never said what I found. And so I think that we're in the great age of archives and of archive work, with facilities that we've never had before. And I think the discussion today around what narratives are we telling or imposing or failing to offer as a concordance. And it's essentially about the structure of the archive. And is there a place for voice and a place for chance? And how do you, as intellectuals and as archivists, leave space for the freedom, chaos, and chance? That is I feel, the true nature of the image.
Wow, that's awesome.
I'm happy to end on that.
Mic drop.
Yeah, well, I am wondering though if you could tell us what archive that was that you were working with, or do you want to make?
Actually, the Robert Veracity.
Okay, thank you. It's just helpful to contextualize.
And that was all of the material from when he was filming in the Arctic. It's now the 50th anniversary, 100th anniversary, next year. And there's all those truths that are in there. So that's one of my next tasks.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences on all those different time frames. And I think we're going to bring this to a close so we can have it and drink some eat.
Yeah.
Thank you.